Before the ash fell, before the sky turned white, before children mistook poison for snow, there was a lagoon so blue it seemed painted by a god who had never imagined war. Bikini Atoll, a ring of 23 coral islands barely wider than a whisper, floating in the central Pacific Ocean, 2,400 miles southwest of Hawaii. In March of 1946, 167 people lived there. They had fished those waters for 2,000 years. They had buried their ancestors in that sand. Their language contained no word for nuclear and no concept for what was coming. On March 7, 1946, U.S. Navy Commodore Ben H. Wyatt arrived on Bikini by sea. He gathered the islanders together on a Sunday after church. Standing before them in his white naval uniform, his words filtered through an interpreter. He told King Judah, the paramount chief, that the United States needed their island. Not forever, he promised, only for a little while. He explained, and these were his exact recorded words, that the testing was for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. He compared the Bikinians to the children of Israel, a chosen people asked by God to make a sacrifice for the benefit of all humanity. King Judah reportedly looked to his people, then back to Wyatt and said in Marshallese, "Everything is in the hands of God." The Navy recorded this as consent. The Bikinians were told they could return when the tests were done. They were not told that the tests would vaporize 3 of their islands entirely. They were not told that the radiation they were about to leave behind would render their home uninhabitable for centuries. Within days, the 167 residents of Bikini were loaded onto a U.S. Navy landing craft and transported 125 miles east to Rongerik Atoll, a smaller, uninhabited island with a fraction of the food resources of Bikini, and a lagoon the Bikinians believed was haunted by evil spirits. No permanent infrastructure awaited them. No adequate food supply had been arranged. American military records from 1947 document that the Bikinians were slowly starving on Rongerik, their body weights declining, their traditional fishing grounds failing because Rongerik's reef fish were partially toxic, inedible species. By 1948, a U.S. Navy physician reported that the relocated people were on the edge of starvation. They were moved again, to Kwajalein, then to Kili Island, each relocation tearing another thread from the fabric of who they were. Kili had no lagoon. A people defined by the sea had been placed on an island where the ocean offered no shelter, no canoe passage, no way to fish in the traditional manner. The displacement did not end. It deepened. Meanwhile, from July 1st, 1946, with Operation Crossroads, the United States began detonating nuclear weapons over the abandoned lagoon of Bikini. The first bomb, called Able, was dropped from a B-29 bomber at an altitude of 29,000 feet on July 1st, 1946. It detonated with a yield of 23 kilotons above a fleet of 95 target ships packed into the lagoon. 5 ships sank immediately. The radiation dispersed widely. 25 days later, on July 25th, Baker, a 23 kiloton device, was detonated 90 feet underwater in Bikini Lagoon. It produced a column of radioactive seawater and coral nearly a mile high, coating every ship in the target fleet with lethal contamination. The Navy could not decontaminate the ships. Some sailors who attempted cleanup work aboard those vessels developed radiation illnesses within months. The United States continued testing. From 1946 to 1958, 67 nuclear and thermonuclear devices were detonated in or near the Marshall Islands, 23 of them at Bikini alone. The total explosive yield of all tests combined was equivalent to detonating 1.5 Hiroshima bombs every single day for 12 consecutive years. The lagoon that King Judah's people had fished for 2 millennia became the most irradiated body of water on the surface of the earth. The White Ash, March 1st, 1954. At exactly 6:45 in the morning on March 1st, 1954, the western sky above the Marshall Islands turned white. Not orange, not red. White, a cold, blinding white that swallowed the horizon whole. John Anjan was 32 years old that morning, the chief magistrate of Rongerik Atoll, sitting outside drinking coffee as he did every dawn. He saw the light before he heard anything. Then came the wind. Then, a sound he later described as unlike any thunder he had ever known. A sound that seemed to come from inside the earth rather than above it. What he was witnessing, though he did not yet know it, was the detonation of Castle Bravo, an American thermonuclear weapon codenamed Shrimp, weighing 23,500 pounds, detonated on a reef island at the northwestern corner of Bikini Atoll, 100 miles to the west of where he stood. The scientist had predicted a yield of approximately 6 megatons. Castle Bravo yielded 15. The bomb was 2.5 times more powerful than any calculation had prepared for. It vaporized the 3 small islands of Namu, Bokonijien, and Arokojlol from the face of the atoll. It excavated a crater 6,500 feet wide and 250 feet deep in the coral reef bed. It created a fireball nearly 5 miles in diameter and a mushroom cloud that rose to a height of 25 miles, pushing 130,000 feet into the stratosphere before spreading outward at its crown to a diameter of more than 60 miles. The blast was so far beyond prediction that the AEC's own instruments were obliterated or could not record the actual yield. At that scale, 15 megatons, equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, the detonation did not merely destroy what it targeted. It rewrote the atmosphere above the Central Pacific for a radius of hundreds of miles. 5 hours after detonation, the fallout reached Rongelap. It came slowly, quietly, in the form of fine white powder that settled onto the island like the lightest possible snow. Rongelap had never seen snow. The children saw the white ash drifting from the sky and ran outside to play in it. They caught it in their hands. They put it in their hair like shampoo. A survivor named Lemio Abon later recalled watching her children do exactly this and not stopping them because she did not know. None of them knew. The powder settled on every surface, on the roofs of homes, in the cooking pots, in the water catchment barrels the community used for drinking. Chief Magistrate John Anjon later described watching the ash fall on himself, on his wife, on his infant son, Lekoj, 1 year old, lying in a cloth hammock under the open sky. The U.S. military knew within hours that Rongelap had been blanketed. Weather reports available before the test had already indicated that winds were blowing toward inhabited atolls. Wind analysis and trajectory models had been produced by military meteorologists at Kwajalein. Documents later declassified in 1994 confirmed that test officials were briefed on those wind patterns before the detonation and chose to proceed. No warning was issued to Rongelap. No evacuation was ordered. U.S. military ships in the area were diverted away from the fallout zone to protect American personnel. The 82 residents of Rongelap, men, women, children, and elderly, remained on their island for 2 full days breathing contaminated air, drinking contaminated water, and eating food covered in radioactive ash. John Anjane warned the people not to drink from the water barrels because the water had turned a visible yellow color, but there was nothing else to drink. Children were thirsty. People drank. Within hours of exposure, the first symptoms began. Nausea and vomiting moved through the community like a wave. Hair began to fall out by the handful. Adults pulling clumps from their scalps, mothers watching strands come loose from their children's heads. Skin turned red, blistered, burned without fire. A U.S. Navy physician who arrived during the evacuation on March 3rd noted in his medical report that children on Rongelap were especially badly affected, with visible skin lesions and severe gastrointestinal distress. The evacuation finally came on March 3rd, 1954, 51 hours after the detonation. By that time, the radioactive contamination had thoroughly penetrated the bodies of every man, woman, and child on the island. They were taken by Navy ship to Kwajalein Atoll, where, on March 7th, 6 days after Bravo, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission quietly opened a classified medical study labeled Project 4.1. Study of response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield weapons. The Marshallese on Kwajalein would not learn they had become research subjects until documents were declassified 4 decades later. Project 4.1, the island is laboratory. When Lee Jeon-ek Nilang was 8 years old, she was standing on Rongelap on the morning of March 1st, 1954. She later became one of the most important witnesses the world would ever hear on the subject of nuclear suffering. In 1985, she addressed the International Court of Justice in The Hague. She told the court exactly what it meant to live inside the fallout zone, not as a statistic, not as a data point in a classified study, but as a human being whose body and whose future had been taken without her knowledge or consent. She told the court that she had suffered 8 miscarriages. She described the births that came after the exposure. Babies born without recognizable human form, with translucent skin like the membrane of a jellyfish, without bones, without eyes, some resembling clusters of grapes rather than children. The Marshallese word for these births entered the English language record as jellyfish babies. Darlene Keju Johnson, a Marshallese health advocate who lobbied internationally throughout the 1980s and who later died of cancer herself, described these births to a World Council of Churches assembly in 1984 in words that were taken down. Verbatim, "Now we have this problem, what we call jellyfish babies. These babies are born like jellyfish. They have no eyes, they have no heads, they have no arms, they have no legs. They do not shape like human beings at all." The official U.S. Atomic Energy Commission press statement, issued in March 1954, stated that the Marshallese had been unexpectedly exposed to some radioactivity, but assured the public that there were no burns and that all were reported well. That statement was a lie. The AEC knew the exposure was severe. What it chose to do with that knowledge was to organize a medical research program, Project 4.1 declassified, that monitored the islanders' deterioration with clinical precision while withholding the nature of the experiment from the people being observed. Physicians from Brookhaven National Laboratory arrived regularly on Rongelap after the community was returned to the island in June 1957, 3 years after the exposure. Despite internal AEC documents acknowledging that radiation contamination on Rongelap remained at levels that posed ongoing health risks. One AEC scientist's internal memo, later declassified, noted that Rongelap offered a unique opportunity to study human beings living in a radiation-contaminated environment. The Rongelapese were not patients being treated. They were specimens being observed. The return to Rongelap in 1957 was itself a continuation of the experiment. Nason Laucon was 4 years old when her family was brought back. She later described people developing blisters on the soles of their feet from walking on the contaminated sand, sand that still carried absorbed radiation from the fallout 3 years prior. She described blisters in people's mouths from eating native foods grown in contaminated soil. By 1963, 9 years after the Bravo test, the Brookhaven physicians began documenting the first wave of thyroid tumors. The thyroid gland concentrates iodine. Radioactive iodine 131 from the fallout had accumulated in the thyroid tissue of every person on Rongelap, with doses to the thyroid glands of young children estimated at 3 times the adult rate, some reaching 7,600 milligrays for those on Rongelap Island itself. By 1976, a Brookhaven National Laboratory report documented that 29 children had been under the age of 10 at the time of the 1954 exposure. Of those 29, fully 20 at least, or 69%, had developed thyroid tumors within 22 years. These were not isolated cases. By the end of the documented study period, a 2005 National Cancer Institute report estimated that more than 1 in 3 Marshall Islanders exposed to fallout from the full testing program would develop some form of cancer attributable to radiation in their lifetimes. The institutional machinery of erasure ran parallel to the medical machinery of study. When the Bikinian leaders asked to return home through the 1960s, U.S. officials cleared a small portion of Bikini for resettlement in 1969, and then, in 1978, evacuated those families again, after routine urine tests revealed that the returning residents had accumulated cesium-137 in their bodies, at levels far exceeding safe exposure. The coconut crabs they had been eating, the breadfruit, the well water, everything growing in the contaminated soil of Bikini had been absorbing radiation for 20 years, and the people who ate from that land were being poisoned all over again. A trust fund established under the Compact of Free Association, the agreement under which the Marshall Islands achieved independence from U.S. administration in 1986, yielded by some calculations the equivalent of $15 per affected person per year. The Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal eventually ruled that the United States owed the Marshallese people $2 billion in compensation. The U.S. Congress refused to appropriate the funds. The tribunal effectively ran out of money in 2011 without the awards being paid. Senator Jeetan Anjan, brother of John Anjan, who had watched the ash fall on his infant son, received the Goldman Environmental Prize in 1992 for his efforts to hold the United States to account. He died the following year, 1993, at the age of 59, of cancer. The children of fallout want ibuwa despise what was left behind. Lekoj Anjan was 1 year old on the morning of March 1st, 1954. He was lying in a cloth hammock in the open air of Rongelap when the white ash began to fall. His father, John Anjan, later wrote that the powder fell on me, it fell on my wife, it fell on our infant son. Lekoj grew up. He was mostly healthy through childhood, the occasional mysterious bruise, but nothing that could be named. Then, shortly after his 18th birthday, Lekoj was flown to a hospital on the U.S. mainland, where doctors discovered he had developed acute myelogenous leukemia. John Anjan flew with his son to the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, and stayed at his bedside through the weeks of chemotherapy. In a letter he later wrote to the Friends of Micronesia newsletter, John described his son's final days with a precision that is almost unbearable to read. Bleeding started in his ears, mouth, and nose, and he seemed to be losing his mind. When I would ask him questions, he gave me no answer except bad luck. Lekoj Anjan died on November 15, 1972. He was 19 years old. He is officially recognized as the sole fatality of the Marshall Islands nuclear tests, a designation that everyone who lived through those years and everyone who has examined the evidence understands to be a profound institutional falsehood. John Anjan kept a notebook. He began it in 1963, 9 years after the Bravo test, when thyroid abnormalities first began appearing visibly in the Rongelap community. He titled it Rongelap Exposed. It contained a list of 86 names, the 63 people who had been on Rongelap Island on March 1st, 1954, the 19 people who had been at the nearby atoll of Ilinganai, and 4 babies born to exposed mothers after the test. Beside each name, Anjan drew marks. A black star meant the person had died. A white star meant the person had undergone thyroid surgery. When the notebook was later examined by journalists and researchers, it carried 26 black stars and 36 white stars. Only 24 of the 86 names had no mark beside them at all. 62 of the 86 people present on Rongelap during the Bravo fallout had either died or undergone surgery as a direct consequence of radiation exposure. In 1958, statistical records documented that the rate of stillbirths and miscarriages among exposed Rongelap women was more than twice the rate of unexposed Marshallese women in the 4 years immediately following 1954. 4 of John Anjan's own children developed cancers attributed to radiation. Lejean Eknilang suffered 8 miscarriages and was never able to carry a child to term. The community of Rongelap lived on their contaminated island until 1985, 31 years after Castle Bravo, because the United States government refused to evacuate them a second time, insisting that radiation levels were within acceptable limits. The Rongelapese did not believe it. They could see the evidence in their own bodies. In 1985, the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior arrived at Rongelap, and in a self-organized evacuation, the entire community, men, women, children, and elderly, packed their belongings and left their ancestral atoll behind, choosing homelessness over poisoning. They have not returned. The Bikinians, relocated in 1946, attempted to go back to their islands in 1969, were poisoned by the contaminated food chain, and were evacuated again in 1978. Their descendant Tomoki Judah, son of King Judah, who had said in 1946 that everything is in the hands of God, later wrote these words: "We left Bikini and have wandered through the ocean for 32 years, and we will never return to our promised land." As of 2024, 70 years after Castle Bravo, the Republic of the Marshall Islands contains no oncology center, no cancer clinic of any kind, in a country where radiation-linked cancers remain generationally elevated. The islands of Bikini remain uninhabitable. Parts of Rongelap remain too contaminated for safe resettlement. On Runit Island at Enuetak Atoll stands the Runit Dome, a massive concrete structure built by the United States in 1979 to contain radioactive soil and debris from the tests, including plutonium, packed inside a blast crater and sealed with concrete 18 inches thick. The dome is cracking. The surrounding seawater is warming with climate change, and the water table beneath the dome is rising. Radioactive material is leaching outward into the Pacific. The United States government has formally declared the dome to be the property of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, disclaiming further responsibility for its maintenance. A small nation of 42,000 people has been left to manage the nuclear waste of the world's most powerful military. What happened in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958, and in the decades of suffering that followed, was not an accident of ignorance. The wind patterns were known before Castle Bravo was detonated. The inhabited atolls were within calculable fallout range. The decision to proceed regardless was made by named individuals sitting in rooms with weather reports in front of them. What followed? The delayed evacuation, the early return to contaminated islands, the classified human experiment, the institutional denial, the inadequate compensation, the abandoned dome, was not the result of negligence. It was the result of a civilization that decided, and continued to decide, that the lives of 167 Marshallese fishermen and their descendants were an acceptable price for understanding what a hydrogen bomb could do. The ash that fell on Lecoq Anjane when he was 1 year old, the ash his father could not sweep away fast enough, it did not fall accidentally. It was sent. And the civilization that sent it has never fully answered for the choice.
And we will never return to our promised land.